A 4-year-old girl pedaled her tricycle in the yard while her mother worked inside. 7 minutes later, she vanished without a trace. For 2 years, investigators searched desperately for answers. When the truth finally emerged, it revealed a predator hiding in plain sight, and a second victim no one knew about. This is the story of Kaylee Poulton, a case that exposed the darkest corners of human nature and revealed how a single failure in justice can cost innocent lives. Kaylee Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989 in Rochester, New York. She entered the world as the only child of parents who showered her with attention and love. Her early years were marked by the warmth of a close-knit family, even as that family structure began to change. When Kaylee turned 3 years old, her parents made the difficult decision to divorce. The separation was amicable, and Kaylee remained with her mother, Judy Poulton. Despite the end of their marriage, Kaylee's father maintained an active presence in his daughter's life, visiting regularly and ensuring she felt loved by both parents. Judy moved with Kaylee to an apartment complex nestled in a quiet suburban area of Rochester. The neighborhood seemed safe, peaceful, the kind of place where children played in yards without fear and neighbors knew each other by name. The complex was surrounded by trees with a fence separating the residential area from the nearby highway. It felt protected, secure. But despite her ex-husband's involvement and financial support, Judy faced economic challenges as a single mother. She worked hard to provide for Kaylee while also trying to create special memories. When Kaylee was 4 years old, Judy took on a part-time job with a specific goal in mind. She wanted to save enough money to take her daughter on a trip to Disney World the following summer. Judy's part-time work involved delivering magazines to customers throughout their neighborhood. It was simple work that fit around her schedule as a mother. The job required her to insert promotional leaflets into magazines before heading out on her delivery route. It was during one of these ordinary work evenings that everything changed forever. The evening of May 23rd, 1994 began like countless others before it. The weather was beautiful, sunny, warm, perfect for playing outside. Judy sat at home around 6:45 in the evening, methodically placing leaflets into magazines, preparing for her delivery shift. Kaylee, energetic and eager as most 4-year-olds are, asked her mother if she could go outside for a walk. She wanted to ride her tricycle in the yard. Judy looked out the window and assessed the situation carefully. The yard was full of children playing together. Other parents were visible. The sun was still bright in the sky. Everything seemed safe and normal. Judy gave her permission with clear instructions. Kaylee was to stay within the yard, nowhere else. The little girl, excited, grabbed her tricycle and ran outside to join the other children. Judy watched her go, then returned to her task. She had only a few minutes of work remaining before she would finish with the leaflets, deliver the magazines, and then take Kaylee to McDonald's as a treat. Those few minutes felt routine, unremarkable. Judy worked efficiently. Placing the last of the leaflets into the magazines, she gathered everything together and carried the stack out to her car, planning to call Kaylee back inside so they could leave for their McDonald's outing. But when Judy stepped outside and looked toward the yard, her daughter was nowhere to be seen. At first, Judy's concern was mild. Perhaps Kaylee had ridden her tricycle around the corner, or maybe she was playing behind a tree. Judy called out her daughter's name. No response came back. She called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Judy walked into the yard, her eyes scanning every visible space. She called Kaylee's name repeatedly, her voice growing more urgent with each repetition. The yard was full of children, but none of them was Kaylee. Judy began walking through the complex grounds, checking behind buildings, near parked cars, around playground equipment. Kaylee was nowhere to be found. What struck Judy as particularly strange was the silence. Kaylee's tricycle made a distinctive creaking noise when she rode it. The wheels squeaked audibly on the pavement. Judy had heard that sound countless times before. But now, as she searched desperately for her daughter, she heard nothing. The tricycle's telltale creak was absent from the evening air. With each passing second, Judy's panic intensified. Her calls became more desperate, more frightened. The other residents of the complex heard her cries and came out to see what was wrong. When Judy explained that Kaylee had disappeared, the neighbors immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Judy asked everyone she encountered if they had seen her daughter. A few people confirmed they had seen Kaylee earlier in the yard, riding her tricycle and playing with other children, but no one knew where she had gone. No one had seen her leave the yard. No one had noticed anything unusual or suspicious. The neighbors joined Judy in searching for Kaylee. They fanned out across the complex, checking every possible location a small child might wander to or hide in. They searched systematically, thoroughly, growing more concerned as the minutes ticked by without any sign of the little girl. The complex territory was largely covered with trees, providing many shaded areas where a child might play or explore. The fence that surrounded the complex separated the residential area from the nearby highway, a barrier that should have kept Kaylee safely contained within the neighborhood. Judy felt certain that Kaylee could not have left the complex on her own. Her daughter knew the rules clearly. She was allowed to ride her tricycle only in their yard. Kaylee had never disobeyed this instruction before. She was a good child, a careful child, one who listened to her mother. Beyond that, even if Kaylee had decided to wander farther than allowed, she could not have gone far on her small tricycle. Someone would have seen her. Someone would have found her by now. The tricycle was small, slow, designed for a 4-year-old child, not for covering significant distances quickly. As the search continued without success, Judy's mind went to the darkest possibility. Someone had taken her daughter. Fearing the worst and feeling time slipping away, Judy made the call she had hoped she would never have to make. She dialed 911. Police officers arrived on the scene within minutes of Judy's call. They immediately recognized the urgency of the situation and began searching the complex and surrounding areas. The initial response was swift and comprehensive. Firefighters joined the effort, along with canine units trained to track missing persons. While the search teams combed through the complex and the surrounding neighborhood, police officers went door to door speaking with residents. They knocked on every door, asked questions, looked for any information that might lead them to Kaylee. The police operated under a strong working theory. If this was indeed a case of abduction, the most logical suspects were residents of the complex itself. An outsider would have faced significant challenges in entering the premises, snatching a child from a yard full of other children and adults, and then escaping without being noticed. The logistics of such an operation seemed nearly impossible for someone unfamiliar with the complex layout. The apartment complex contained 300 individual units, a substantial number of potential locations to search. The residents, horrified by what had happened and genuinely wanting to help, willingly allowed police officers into their homes. They opened their doors without hesitation. You permitted thorough searches, answered questions cooperatively. In cases where residents were not home when officers knocked, the complex manager used spare keys to grant police access to those apartments. The authorities were determined to search every single unit, to leave no stone unturned in their effort to find Kaylee. Despite this exhaustive effort, the search yielded no results. Kaylee was not found in any apartment. Her distinctive tricycle with its creaking wheels was not discovered in any storage area, closet, or hiding place. As the evening turned to night and night wore on toward morning, the search continued without pause. Officers worked through the darkness, refusing to give up, hoping for any breakthrough that might lead them to the missing child. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, approximately 9 hours after Kaylee's disappearance, the case was officially reclassified. What had begun as a missing child report was now being treated as a kidnapping. A special investigative unit took over the case, bringing additional resources and expertise to bear on the mystery. Detectives from the specialized unit sat down with Judy Poulton to conduct a detailed interview. They needed to understand everything about Kaylee's life, her family, her relationships, anything that might provide a clue to what had happened. The investigators asked Judy if there was anyone in their lives who might wish them harm. They explored the possibility of family involvement, as statistics show that family members are often responsible in child abduction cases. They asked about Kaylee's father and his relationship with Judy and Kaylee. Judy was adamant in her response. Kaylee's father could not possibly be involved. He had absolutely no reason to kidnap his own daughter. He had regular visitation rights, maintained a good relationship with both Judy and Kaylee, and had shown no signs of dissatisfaction with the custody arrangement. The divorce had been amicable, and he had never expressed any desire to have full custody or to take Kaylee away from her mother. The detectives accepted this explanation but continued their questioning. They asked if there was anyone among the complex residents who had behaved strangely or suspiciously. This question triggered a memory in Judy's mind, an observation she had made in recent weeks that had troubled her at the time. Judy told the detectives about a 22-year-old man named Mark Christie who had recently moved into the complex with his wife and their 1.5-year-old son. According to Judy, Mark's behavior had seemed very unusual, even alarming, from the beginning of their acquaintance. Judy and Mark had encountered each other several times in the yard, where their children sometimes played. They had engaged in what should have been normal, friendly conversations between neighbors, but Mark had said things that made Judy deeply uncomfortable. On one occasion, Mark had commented that Kaylee was very beautiful. On the surface, this was an innocent compliment, the kind of thing people say about children all the time. But Judy felt there was something off about the tone in which Mark delivered this observation. The words themselves were normal, but something in his voice, his manner, his demeanor made them feel inappropriate, unsettling. After making this comment about Kaylee's beauty, Mark had added something even more disturbing. He told Judy that he had been watching all the little girls in the complex, and Kaylee was the prettiest of them all. This statement sent alarm bells ringing in Judy's mind. Why would a grown man be watching all the little girls in the complex? Why would he feel it was appropriate to tell a mother that he had been observing her daughter and other children? Why would he rank their physical appearance? The entire conversation struck Judy as highly inappropriate and deeply suspicious. After this interaction, Judy made a conscious decision to avoid Mark Christie whenever possible. She no longer sought out casual conversations with him. When she saw him in the yard, she would find a reason to go back inside or to move to a different area. She wanted to minimize contact between her family and this man whose words had raised such red flags. Despite her efforts to avoid him, Judy and Mark continued to encounter each other occasionally. An inevitability in an apartment complex where residents shared common outdoor spaces. During one of these subsequent encounters, Mark asked Judy a question that alarmed her even more than his previous comments. He asked whether Kaylee would tell her mother if someone tried to touch her inappropriately. Judy was stunned by this question. Why would Mark ask such a thing? What possible innocent explanation could there be for a neighbor, a near stranger, to ask whether a 4-year-old child would report sexual abuse to her parent? Judy answered yes with as much firmness as she could muster, then immediately left the yard with Kaylee. She considered Mark's question extremely suspicious, a massive violation of appropriate boundaries. From that point forward, she was even more vigilant about keeping Kaylee away from Mark Christie. Prior to these disturbing conversations, Kaylee had enjoyed playing with Mark's young son on the playground. The two children had interacted the way young children do, engaged in innocent play while their parents watched, but after Mark's inappropriate questions and comments, Judy prohibited Kaylee from playing with Mark's son, even when Judy herself was present to supervise. The risk seemed too great. The warning signs were too clear. As Judy recounted these interactions with Mark Christie to the detectives, she remembered another detail that seemed significant in hindsight. She recalled that just a few minutes after she had gone outside to look for Kaylee, she had seen Mark in the yard, emerging from his apartment with his young son, heading toward the playground. Judy had approached him immediately and asked if he had seen Kaylee. Mark had answered no, showing no particular reaction to the question, no apparent concern about a missing child in the complex where he lived. But Judy had noticed something strange about Mark's appearance in that moment. At the time, her mind had been completely consumed by fear for her daughter, so she had not given this detail much thought. Now, speaking with detectives, the memory came back into sharp focus. Mark's sneakers had been missing their shoelaces. This observation, which had seemed merely odd at the time, now took on potentially sinister significance. Why would someone's shoes be missing laces? Had those laces been used for something else? Had they been used to restrain or harm Kaylee? The detectives listened to Judy's account with great interest. Mark Christie had made himself a person of interest through his own behavior. His inappropriate comments about children, his suspicious questions, his presence in the yard shortly after Kaylee's disappearance, and the strange detail about his missing shoelaces. The investigators decided they needed to speak with Mark Christie directly. They brought him in for questioning at the police station. The interview began with standard questions about the day of Kaylee's disappearance, Mark's movements, his interactions with the child, his knowledge of what had happened. Mark denied any involvement in Kaylee's disappearance. He maintained that he had been home with his son, that he had not seen Kaylee that evening until he went outside to the playground with his child, and that he had no knowledge of what had happened to her. The detectives pressed him on various points but could not break through his denials. Mark remained calm, consistent in his story, and unwavering in his assertions of innocence. Finally, the investigators made a significant decision. They asked Mark if he would be willing to take a polygraph test. Mark agreed without hesitation. A polygraph examination, commonly known as a lie detector test, measures physiological responses while a subject answers questions. The underlying theory is that deceptive answers will produce different physiological reactions than truthful ones. While polygraph results are not admissible as evidence in most courts, they are often used by investigators as a tool to help focus their investigation. Mark Christie sat through the FUI polygraph examination and answered all the questions posed to him. The operator who conducted the test analyzed the results and delivered his conclusion. He did not detect any false answers. According to the polygraph, Mark Christie was telling the truth when he said he had no involvement in Kaylee Poulton's disappearance. Based on this result, the detectives had to release Mark. Without evidence contradicting the polygraph findings, they could not hold him or charge him with any crime. Furthermore, Judy herself had essentially provided Mark with an alibi. She had seen him outside on the playground with his son at almost the exact time when she was frantically searching for Kaylee. If Mark had been outside in plain view during those critical minutes, how could he have been involved in Kaylee's abduction? The police also conducted a search of Mark's apartment during the early hours of the investigation. They looked thoroughly through his living space, searching for any sign of Kaylee or her tricycle. They found nothing. No child, no bicycle, no evidence connecting Mark Christie to the disappearance. With the polygraph showing no deception, with an apparent alibi placing him in the yard during the critical time period, and with no physical evidence found in his apartment, Mark Christie was eliminated as a suspect. The detectives had to look elsewhere for answers, with Mark Christie no longer under suspicion. And no other strong leads emerging from the door-to-door canvassing of the complex, the police investigation began to focus on the person closest to Kaylee, her mother, Judy Poulton. This shift in focus was not unusual. In cases involving missing or harmed children, investigators routinely examine family members closely. Statistics show that parents are involved in a significant percentage of cases where children disappear or are injured. The police needed to rule out Judy's involvement before they could fully direct their resources elsewhere. Judy understood intellectually that this scrutiny was part of standard investigative procedure. She knew the police had to consider all possibilities, even uncomfortable ones. She cooperated fully, answering the same questions repeatedly, submitting to multiple interviews, allowing investigators to examine every aspect of her life and her relationship with Kaylee. But understanding the necessity of this process did not make it any less painful. Judy was living through every parent's worst nightmare. Her child had vanished without a trace. She was consumed by fear, grief, and desperate hope that Kaylee would be found alive. And while she endured this emotional torment, she also had to face the reality that the police investigating her daughter's disappearance considered her a potential suspect. The knowledge that detectives were spending significant time investigating her, time that could potentially be spent finding Kaylee, added another layer of suffering to Judy's already unbearable situation. She wanted the police to be out there searching, following leads, finding her daughter. Instead, they were questioning her repeatedly, analyzing her statements, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. Days turned into weeks, and weeks began to turn into months. The intensive search efforts that had marked the first hours and days after Kaylee's disappearance gradually diminished. The police continued to investigate, but without new leads or evidence, the case began to cool. Information about Kaylee Poulton's disappearance quickly spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting Kaylee's photograph and details of her disappearance to viewers throughout the Rochester area and beyond. Judy worked with police and media to ensure Kaylee's case remained in the public eye. Billboards featuring Kaylee's image and information about her disappearance were erected throughout the city. Flyers were printed by the thousands and distributed widely, posted on telephone poles, in store windows, on community bulletin boards, anywhere people might see them and remember Kaylee's face. The police received numerous calls from the public in response to this media coverage. Tips poured in from people who thought they might have seen Kaylee, or who remembered something suspicious from the day she disappeared, or who had theories about what might have happened. The total number of tips quickly exceeded 1,000, a massive volume of information for investigators to process and evaluate. Each tip, no matter how unlikely it seemed, was checked thoroughly. Investigators followed up on every lead, pursued every possibility, hoping that one of these tips would finally break the case open and lead them to Kaylee. Unfortunately, none of them did. Every lead was investigated and ultimately led to a dead end. Every potential sighting turned out to be a different child. Every theory, when examined closely, fell apart. As the investigation stretched on month after month with no resolution, the case officially went cold. This designation did not mean police stopped caring about Kaylee or stopped working on her case entirely, but it did mean that active daily investigation ceased. Without new leads or evidence, there was simply nowhere for the investigation to go. For most families, a cold case designation would mark the beginning of a slow fade into obscurity, a gradual acceptance that answers might never come, that closure might never be possible. But Judy Poulton was not most parents, and she refused to accept this fate for her daughter's case. Despite the lack of progress in the official police investigation, Judy never stopped hoping to find Kaylee alive. She never accepted that her daughter was gone forever. She maintained an unwavering belief that Kaylee was out there somewhere, waiting to be found and brought home. Judy left her job delivering magazines, the job she had been working the evening Kaylee disappeared. She dedicated all her time, all her energy, all her resources to searching for her daughter and keeping the case alive in public consciousness. She became a one-woman media campaign, constantly printing new flyers and posting them throughout Rochester and surrounding communities. She reached out to television stations, radio programs, newspapers, magazines, any media outlet that might be willing to cover Kaylee's story and remind the public that this little girl was still missing. Judy's tireless efforts began to attract support from compassionate people throughout the community. Strangers who were moved by her determination and by Kaylee's story offered to help in various ways. Some assisted with printing and distributing flyers, multiplying Judy's reach far beyond what she could accomplish alone. Others contributed financially to support the search efforts. Through donations from caring individuals and fundraising events organized by volunteers, supporters managed to raise $100,000, a substantial sum that was offered as a reward for any information that could lead to finding Kaylee or solving the case. This reward was publicized widely, appearing on flyers, in media coverage, and in public announcements. Judy and her supporters hoped that financial incentive might motivate someone with knowledge to come forward, perhaps someone who had seen something suspicious, or someone who had heard a confession, or even someone who had been involved but now felt remorse. Judy succeeded in getting Kaylee's case covered on national television, an impressive achievement that would significantly expand awareness of her daughter's disappearance beyond Rochester and even beyond New York State. She was invited to appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show, one of the most watched television programs in America at that time. This appearance brought Kaylee's case to millions of viewers across the country. Additionally, information about Kaylee's disappearance was featured twice on a popular television show dedicated to unsolved crimes. This show had a track record of generating useful tips from viewers, and in some cases had even helped solve previously cold cases. Judy hoped that one of these broadcasts might reach the right person, someone who held the key to finding out what had happened to Kaylee. Judy also demonstrated remarkable creativity and persistence in finding new ways to keep Kaylee's case visible. She approached local businesses and persuaded many of them to display flyers with information about Kaylee's disappearance in their offices, stores, and on their company vehicles. Delivery trucks, service vans, and other commercial vehicles became mobile billboards carrying Kaylee's image and story throughout the region. In one particularly innovative effort, Judy convinced 2 airlines to include flyers about Kaylee in the envelopes with passenger tickets. This meant that travelers flying through Rochester would receive information about the missing child, potentially reaching people from all over the country who might have information or might spread awareness when they returned to their home cities. All of these efforts succeeded in generating new tips for police to investigate. People who saw the television appearances, the billboards, the flyers, or the airline inserts would call the police tip line with information. Each new wave of media coverage would prompt another surge of calls from concerned citizens who wanted to help. The police, to their credit, continued to diligently investigate each new tip that came in, even as the case remained officially cold. They followed up on every lead, no matter how slim the chances seemed. They remained hopeful that one of these tips would finally provide the breakthrough they needed. But month after month, the pattern repeated itself. tips would come in, investigators would check them out, and each one would ultimately lead nowhere. The person who knew what had really happened to Kaylee Poulton either was not seeing the media coverage or was choosing to remain silent. 2 full years passed this way. 2 years of relentless searching, 2 years of hope and heartbreak, 2 years of Judy Poulton refusing to give up on finding her daughter while police continued to work a case that seemed impossibly cold and unsolvable. And then, in a completely unexpected turn of events, everything changed. On August 9th, 1996, more than 2 years after Kaylee Poulton vanished from her apartment complex yard, a woman picked up her telephone and dialed 911. The call she was about to make would finally break open the case that had tormented Judy Poulton and baffled investigators for so long. The woman on the phone told the emergency dispatcher that she needed to speak with police about a serious matter. She explained that she had just had a terrible argument with her husband. An argument that had revealed something shocking, something that needed to be reported immediately. When police officers arrived to speak with the woman in person, she provided them with disturbing details. According to her account, she had been growing increasingly tired of her husband's strange behavior over the past 2 years. The stress and tension in their marriage had finally reached a breaking point, and she had told him she wanted a divorce. Her husband had not taken this news well. He had pleaded with her not to leave him, trying various tactics to persuade her to stay. He attempted to evoke her sympathy by telling her how difficult things had been for him, how much he had been suffering. And then, in what must have seemed like a desperate attempt to explain his emotional state and gain her understanding, the man had confessed something horrifying to his wife. He told her that he had killed Kaylee Poulton. The woman was plunged into deep shock by this confession. The case of the missing 4-year-old girl had been all over the news for 2 years. Everyone in Rochester knew about Kaylee Poulton. Flyers with her face were everywhere, and now her own husband was telling her that he was responsible for the child's disappearance and death. The woman's immediate reaction was to protect herself and her child. She gathered up their 1.5-year-old son, left their home, and went to her father's house. From there, in safety, she called 911 to report what her husband had told her. Finally, she revealed her husband's name to the police officer taking her statement. It was Mark Christie, Judy Poulton's former neighbor, the man who had been questioned early in the investigation, the man who had passed a polygraph test and been cleared as a suspect. The detectives who received this information were both excited and troubled. After 2 years of dead ends and frustration, they finally had a confession, but it came with a serious legal complication that threatened to make the information useless. Under New York state law at that time, any information shared between spouses was protected by spousal privilege. This legal principle meant that communications between a husband and wife were confidential and could not be used as evidence in court. The law was designed to protect the sanctity of marriage and encourage open communication between spouses without fear that their words might be used against them in legal proceedings. In practical terms, this meant that even though Mark Christie had apparently confessed to killing Kaylee Poulton, the police were not allowed to use that confession to arrest him or to question him about it. His wife's testimony about what he had told her would not be admissible in court. Without additional evidence or a confession obtained through proper legal channels, Mark Christie could not be prosecuted. The detectives faced a frustrating paradox. They now knew who was responsible for Kaylee's disappearance, but they could not act on that knowledge in any meaningful way. Furthermore, as the investigators reviewed the case file, they were reminded of factors that had initially led them to clear Mark Christie as a suspect. His apartment had been thoroughly searched in the early hours of the investigation, and no evidence of Kaylee or her tricycle had been found. Judy Poulton had seen Mark in the yard with his child, shortly after Kaylee's disappearance, providing him with what appeared to be an alibi. Given the timeline Judy had described, it seemed impossible that Mark could have had time to kidnap Kaylee, harm her, hide her body, and then appear in the yard acting normally with his young son. The logistics simply did not seem to work. Many investigators might have been discouraged by these obstacles and given up, but Detective Crow, who had taken the phone call from Mark's wife, was not willing to let this opportunity slip away. He had worked on Kaylee's case from the beginning. He had seen Judy Poulton suffering. He had witnessed her tireless efforts to find her daughter. He was determined to find a way to get justice for Kaylee, even if the path forward was not clear. Detective Crow began by gathering more information about Mark Christie and his movements since Kaylee's disappearance. What he learned was deeply troubling and added to his suspicions about the man. Crowe discovered that Mark and his family had moved out of the apartment complex where Kaylee had lived just a few weeks after her disappearance. This timing alone was not necessarily suspicious. Many people move for various legitimate reasons, but the circumstances surrounding the move raised red flags. According to records Crowe uncovered, Mark Christie had been reported to complex management by the parents of two young girls who lived in the building. These parents had complained that Mark had been standing naked in his doorway, visible from the hallway and the yard, in plain sight of anyone who happened to pass by, including children. No formal investigation had been conducted into this matter at the time. Technically, Mark had been inside his own home when the incidents occurred, so it was unclear whether any laws had actually been broken. Complex management had apparently decided that the easiest solution was to encourage Mark and his family to move elsewhere, which they did. But to Detective Crowe, this behavior seemed extremely suspicious and entirely consistent with someone who had inappropriate sexual interest in children. Combined with Judy Poulton's earlier observations about Mark's disturbing comments regarding little girls, a troubling pattern was emerging. Detective Crowe learned that Mark had relocated to another city approximately 50 miles from Rochester. Armed with the address, Crowe decided to pay Mark Christie a visit, even though he knew he would be limited in what he could say or ask due to the spousal privilege issue. When Crowe arrived at Mark's new residence and knocked on the door, he was met with an unpleasant surprise. Instead of Mark answering the door, Mark's mother appeared. She informed the detective that her son would not be speaking with police without a lawyer present, and that they had already called their attorney. It was immediately clear to Detective Crowe that Mark had learned about his wife's call to the police. Someone, whether his wife, another family member, or someone else, had warned him that authorities knew about his confession. Mark had lawyered up, taking the smart legal step that any attorney would advise for someone in his position. Crowe understood the difficult situation he faced. Since the confession Mark had made to his wife could not be used in court, Mark's lawyer could simply prohibit his client from speaking to police. Without any other evidence connecting Mark to Kaylee's disappearance and murder, Mark could continue living freely without fear of prosecution. The case would remain unsolved, and Judy Poulton would never know what had happened to her daughter. But Detective Crowe was not ready to give up yet. He was a skilled investigator who understood human psychology and knew how to build rapport with suspects. He decided to try a different approach. While Detective Crowe stood at the door speaking with Mark's mother, Mark himself eventually emerged from inside the house. Crowe saw his opportunity and took it. Rather than approaching Mark in an aggressive or accusatory manner, the detective adopted a calm, friendly tone. Crowe explained to Mark that he just wanted to ask a few questions about Kaylee's case. He acknowledged that it had been a long time since they had last spoken, back during the initial investigation. He suggested that perhaps they could go somewhere neutral and comfortable to talk, maybe grab a cup of coffee at a nearby restaurant. This approach was deliberate and calculated. Crowe wanted to make Mark feel relaxed, not threatened. He wanted to appeal to Mark's ego and make him feel like he was in control of the situation. The detective gambled that Mark, believing himself safe from prosecution due to spousal privilege, might be willing to talk. To Crowe's surprise, Mark agreed to the meeting. However, he set one condition. After they talked, the detective would need to drive him to his lawyer's office as promised. Crowe readily agreed to this condition. The two men got into Crowe's vehicle and drove to a nearby Italian restaurant. They went inside, found a table, and ordered food and coffee. And then Detective Crowe began one of the most important conversations of his career. Crowe was careful not to push too hard or to ask direct, aggressive questions that might make Mark shut down or invoke his right to an attorney. Instead, he engaged in casual conversation, building rapport, making Mark feel comfortable and respected. The detective's patience and tactical approach began to pay off. While they waited for their food to arrive, Mark suddenly started talking about the case. He expressed regret for what he had done to Kaylee, saying that his actions had haunted him for the past 2 years. According to Mark, he constantly saw Kaylee's face in the news and on the flyers that were still posted all over Rochester and surrounding areas. Her image haunted him everywhere he went. He could not escape the thought reminder of what he had done. Detective Crowe continued to proceed cautiously, maintaining his soft, understanding tone. He did not want to spook Mark with excessive pressure or judgment. He needed Mark to keep talking, to provide details that could be verified and potentially used to build a case. Crowe had known Mark since the early days of the investigation, and they had spoken before during the initial questioning. The detective had developed a theory about Mark's psychology. He believed that Mark was actually proud of himself for having outsmarted the police and avoided punishment for so long. Playing on this theory, Crowe decided to appeal to Mark's ego. He told Mark that he had indeed managed to deceive an entire team of experienced investigators working on the case. He acknowledged Mark's cleverness in evading detection. This tactic proved effective. Mark replied that he did not want to sound like he was bragging or being proud of himself, but the way he had gotten rid of Kaylee's tricycle was truly ingenious. He had outsmarted all of them. Mark then asked Detective Crow if he wanted to know the details about what he had done with the bicycle. However, he warned the detective that he would only talk about the bicycle and nothing more. He was not ready to discuss other aspects of the case. Crow maintained his careful, non-threatening approach. He reassured Mark that he did not have to talk about anything he did not want to discuss. The detective wanted to gather as much information as possible without pushing so hard that Mark would stop talking or demand to speak with his lawyer. Mark began to explain his method for disposing of Kaylee's distinctive tricycle, the one piece of physical evidence that could have immediately connected him to her disappearance. According to Mark, Kaylee's tricycle had been in his apartment for 3 days following her disappearance. This revelation was significant, as it meant the tricycle had been there when police conducted their initial search of his apartment, yet somehow the officers had not found it. Mark explained that he had anticipated the police search. He knew that when a child goes missing, particularly in a situation suggesting possible abduction, police do not need a warrant to search homes in the immediate area. The exigent circumstances, the urgent need to find a missing child who might still be alive, override normal warrant requirements. However, Mark had identified what he considered a loophole in the law. He understood that while police could search without a warrant when looking for a missing child, they were specifically searching for the child herself, not for evidence of a crime. This meant they would only look in places where a 4-year-old child could potentially fit or hide. With this understanding, Mark had devised a plan. He quickly disassembled Kaylee's tricycle, cutting it into small pieces. He then hid these pieces in various locations throughout his apartment, specifically in places that were obviously too small to contain a child. For example, Mark wrapped some pieces of the tricycle in clothes and stuffed them into closets and drawers. Other pieces he placed in small bags. When police searched his apartment looking for Kaylee, they checked closets and cabinets by opening them and looking inside, but they were looking for a child, not for bicycle parts wrapped in clothing or hidden in bags. After the initial police search concluded and officers left his apartment, Mark began the process of removing the tricycle pieces from his home. He placed them in small bags and took them out to his car gradually over the course of several days. This part of Mark's plan was particularly bold. Police had stationed officers at the exit of the apartment complex, and they were inspecting vehicles that left the property. But just like with the apartment search, they were looking for Kaylee herself, a missing 4-year-old child, small bags in. A car did not attract their attention or suspicion. Mark systematically transported the pieces of the tricycle far away from the complex and disposed of them in various locations where they would never be found or connected to Kaylee's case. As Detective Crow listened to this explanation, he realized several things. First, Mark's account explained why the initial apartment search had failed to find the tricycle despite it being there. Second, it demonstrated significant premeditation and calculation on Mark's part. And third, it showed that Mark took pride in having outsmarted the police, exactly as Crow had suspected. Detective Crow recognized that he had a genuine opportunity to obtain a full confession from Mark Christie. The man was clearly willing to talk, perhaps driven by a psychological need to tell someone about his cleverness, or perhaps genuinely burdened by guilt and seeking some form of relief. Crow carefully steered the conversation toward the question of what had actually happened to Kaylee. He began to suggest to Mark that perhaps Kaylee's death had not been his fault, that maybe it had been a tragic accident rather than a deliberate murder. This approach served multiple purposes. It allowed Mark to potentially save face by framing what happened as less heinous than cold-blooded murder. It also demonstrated to Mark that the detective was willing to consider his perspective and give him the benefit of the doubt. In response to this suggestion, Mark asked what kind of prison sentence he might face if he were convicted. Detective Crow answered honestly that the sentence would likely be around 25 years for a murder conviction. Mark responded that such a sentence would be unfair to him. He said it would be unjust to make him spend half his life behind bars, separated from his wife and young son. He added that for the past 2 years, he had been living in his own personal hell, tormented by what he had done, and that this suffering should count for something when considering his punishment. To Detective Crow, there was an obvious lack of logic and self-awareness in Mark's words. Mark was suggesting that his own emotional discomfort over murdering a 4-year-old child should somehow mitigate his punishment, or absolve him of full responsibility. He seemed unable or unwilling to consider Kaylee's suffering, or Judy's suffering, or the fact that his actions had destroyed multiple lives. But Crow did not voice these thoughts. He continued with his tactical approach, nodding sympathetically and appearing to consider Mark's perspective seriously. He told Mark that perhaps sharing the full truth about what had happened would ease his suffering. Perhaps confession would provide some relief from the hell he had been living in. Mark seemed to consider this idea. He replied that he was ready to confess everything, to tell the complete truth about what had happened to Kaylee Poulton. However, he added that he would only do so after first speaking with his lawyer. Detective Crow knew that this would be a disaster for the case. No competent lawyer would allow a client to confess to a murder when there was no physical evidence against him, and when the only existing confession was protected by spousal privilege and therefore inadmissible in court. If Mark left the restaurant and spoke with his attorney before providing a formal confession, the opportunity would be lost forever. Crow decided to be direct and honest with Mark about this reality. He explained that if Mark spoke with a lawyer first, that lawyer would absolutely prohibit him from confessing to anything. The attorney would point out that without a usable confession or physical evidence, Mark could not be prosecuted. He would advise Mark to remain silent and to refuse to answer any questions from police. Crow added that if things played out that way, Kaylee's parents would never know what had truly happened to their daughter. They would never know if she had suffered before her death. They would never be able to properly bury her and say goodbye. They would live the rest of their lives with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Mark's response to this statement was crucial. He said, "She didn't suffer." Detective Crow recognized that Mark was on the edge of providing a full confession. The detective sensed that with just a little more encouragement, Mark would tell him everything. Crow told Mark that it was time to do the right thing, for himself, for his family, and for God. He suggested that unburdening himself of this terrible secret would provide relief and perhaps even redemption. Mark looked at the detective for a long moment, and then he finally admitted to what he had done. He began to tell the story of what had happened to Kaylee Poulton on the evening of May 23rd, 1994. Mark repeated his earlier statement that Kaylee had not suffered. He said that he had strangled her, but he immediately added that he had not done anything else to her, meaning he claimed that he had not sexually assaulted her. According to Mark's account on that evening, Kaylee had come to his apartment and asked if she could play with his 1.5-year-old son. Mark said he had allowed her inside and had taken her tricycle to his kitchen to keep it out of sight. He knew that Kaylee's mother would not approve of her daughter being in his apartment without permission, so he wanted to avoid attracting attention from neighbors or passers-by who might see the tricycle outside his door. Kaylee went upstairs to the second floor of Mark's apartment, to his son's room, where she began playing with the young child. According to Mark, about 10 minutes passed while Kaylee played with his son. Then Mark heard Judy Poulton's voice from outside in the yard, calling for her daughter. Kaylee's name echoed through the complex as Judy searched for her child. Mark said he panicked at that moment. He realized that Kaylee's mother would be furious that he had let the girl into his house without permission. He feared the consequences of this discovery, the questions that would be asked, the suspicion that would fall on him. In response to this panic, according to his confession, Mark went upstairs to his son's room and strangled Kaylee with his bare hands. As Detective Crow listened to Mark's story, he immediately had serious doubts about certain aspects of the narrative. The version Mark was telling sounded calculated to minimize his culpability and the heinousness of his crime. Crow found it much more likely that Mark had deliberately lured Kaylee into his apartment under the pretext of letting her play with his son. This would explain why Kaylee, who had been told by her mother to stay in the yard, would have gone into Mark's home. She thought she was just going to play with a toddler she knew. The detective also suspected that Mark's true motive was sexual. He likely intended to molest Kaylee, taking advantage of the fact that his wife was at work and he was alone in the apartment with just his young son, who was too little to understand or remember what was happening. When Mark heard Judy calling for Kaylee in the yard, he probably became frightened that Kaylee would tell her mother what he had done to her. To prevent this revelation and the consequences that would follow, he killed her. Detective Crow also remembered the detail Judy had mentioned about Mark's missing shoelaces when she saw him in the yard shortly after Kaylee disappeared. This suggested that Mark had used the shoelaces to strangle Kaylee, which would mean he had taken the time to remove them from his shoes before killing her. This premeditation contradicted Mark's story that the killing was a spontaneous panic response. It appeared that Mark was trying to minimize the severity of his crime by changing key details. He wanted to portray himself as someone who made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic, rather than someone who deliberately planned to assault and murder a 4-year-old child. But Detective Crow understood that if he voiced these doubts and challenged Mark's story, Mark might become defensive, stop talking, and refuse to reveal what he had done with Kaylee's body. Knowing the location of Kaylee's remains was crucial for the case, for prosecution, and most importantly, for giving Judy some measure of closure. So Crow continued to play along, listening without judgment or contradiction, gathering as much information as possible before Mark could change his mind or invoke his right to legal counsel. Mark continued his confession by describing what he did after killing Kaylee. According to his account, he took Kaylee's body downstairs to the kitchen and left it on the floor. Then he took his young son and went outside to establish an alibi for himself. Mark said he could still hear Judy calling for her daughter in the yard. He deliberately wanted to be seen by Judy and others to dispel any potential suspicions. This explained why Judy had encountered Mark in the yard with his son shortly after she began searching for Kaylee. His presence there was not coincidental, but calculated. After Judy saw him and then moved on to search other parts of the complex, Mark returned to his apartment. He placed Kaylee's body in a laundry basket and covered it with clothes to conceal it from view. A few minutes later, Mark took the laundry basket outside and placed it in the trunk of his car. He then took his son with him, likely strapping the toddler into a car seat, and drove away from the complex. By this time, according to Mark, there were already many people in the yard helping Judy search for Kaylee. The scene was chaotic, with neighbors calling out, searching different areas, comparing notes about whether anyone had seen the missing girl. In this chaos, Mark claimed nobody even noticed him carrying a laundry basket to his car and driving away with his son. Mark's destination was the company where he worked as a security guard. This detail was significant. It meant Mark had access to the facility and knew the layout well, including any areas that might provide opportunities for concealing a body. Mark parked his car near the back of the large building and temporarily left the laundry basket containing Kaylee's body by the back door. He then drove around to the front of the building and entered through the main entrance. This was a work day for most people, but Mark had the day off. He needed an excuse for being at his workplace on his day off, so he told his coworkers that he had forgotten something at work and needed to retrieve it. This explanation did not raise any suspicions. People forget things at work all the time. Mark walked through the building and opened the back door from the inside. He retrieved the laundry basket with Kaylee's body and carried it to a particular location within the facility, a huge tank that held 30,000 gallons of liquid coolant. Mark climbed up onto this enormous tank, opened the lid at the top, and prepared to dispose of Kaylee's body. But first, he tied a heavy metal object to her to ensure that her body would sink and remain submerged in the liquid coolant, hidden from view. He then dropped Kaylee into the tank and closed the lid. Afterwards, Mark disposed of all of Kaylee's clothing separately. However, he specifically noted that he did not remove Kaylee's earrings, a detail that would later help with identifying her remains. Once he had completed the disposal of Kaylee's body and clothing, Mark returned home to the apartment complex. Despite having just murdered a child and hidden her body, he immediately joined the search for Kaylee along with all the other neighbors who were trying to help Judy find her missing daughter. In Mark's own words, he had managed to remove Kaylee's body from the complex even before the police became involved in the case, and no one had noticed anything suspicious about his actions. At the end of his confession, Mark stated that killing Kaylee had been a terrible mistake. He said he should not have done it, a statement that was remarkable for its understatement and for its focus on his own regret rather than on the enormity of what he had done to an innocent child and her family. Having obtained all the information he needed, the details of how Kaylee died, what Mark had done with her body, where her remains could be found, Detective Crow paid for their meals at the restaurant. Notably, Mark left a $2 tip for their server, a bizarrely normal gesture in the midst of this extraordinary conversation. Mark then willingly accompanied Detective Crow to the police station, just as he had come to the restaurant willingly. At the station, he was formally arrested on a charge of murder. As soon as Mark's lawyer learned about his client's confession, he immediately attempted to have it withdrawn and declared inadmissible. The attorney argued that his client had been under duress, had not properly understood his rights, or had been coerced in some way. However, these arguments did not succeed. The facts were clear. Mark had provided all the information voluntarily. He had not been in custody when he confessed. He had been sitting in a restaurant, free to leave at any time. Detective Crow had not broken any laws or violated Mark's constitutional rights. Mark had been explicitly told he could speak with his lawyer, and he had chosen to confess instead. The confession would stand. Police immediately went to Mark's workplace and located the large tank he had described. They opened it and searched the contents. 2 years after Kaylee Poulton's disappearance, her body was still inside the tank. Submerged in the liquid coolant exactly where Mark had placed her, the chemical properties of the coolant had preserved her remains to some degree, though the advanced state of decomposition made detailed forensic analysis impossible. Medical examiners could not determine the exact cause of death or identify any specific injuries or trauma to the body. The decomposition was too extensive to reveal whether Kaylee had been strangled, as Mark claimed, or whether any sexual assault had occurred prior to her death. However, forensic experts were able to confirm the identity of the remains. The body was indeed that of Kaylee Poulton. Among the identifying factors were the earrings still present on the body, the earrings Mark had specifically mentioned not removing. After more than 2 years of searching, hoping, and not knowing, Judy Poulton finally got her daughter back. Not alive and well as she had desperately hoped, but at least she could properly bury Kaylee and know the truth about what had happened to her. The recovery of Kaylee's body also meant that Mark Christie could not claim his confession had been fabricated or coerced. The physical evidence corroborated his account. Kaylee's body was exactly where he said it would be, with the metal weight attached to it as he had described. Mark Christie appeared before a judge to enter his plea and face sentencing for the murder of Kaylee Poulton. Faced with overwhelming evidence, his own detailed confession, and the recovery of Kaylee's body exactly where he said it would be, Mark admitted his guilt. He pleaded guilty to murder charges and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison, exactly as Detective Crow had told him to expect. This meant Mark would have to serve at least 25 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. There was no guarantee he would actually be released at that time. Parole boards would have to evaluate whether he had been rehabilitated and whether he posed a continued danger to society. Mark's defense attorney managed to negotiate one aspect of the plea deal that worked in his client's favor. The kidnapping charges that had originally been filed against Mark were dropped as part of the agreement. He would only face punishment for the murder itself, not for the additional crime of kidnapping. While this might seem like a significant concession, the practical impact was minimal. Mark was still facing a lengthy prison sentence that would consume most of his adult life. The murder charge alone was sufficient to ensure he would be behind bars for decades. For Judy Poulton, the sentencing brought a mixture of emotions. There was some relief in knowing that Kaylee's killer would face consequences for what he had done. There was satisfaction in seeing Mark Christie finally held accountable after 2 years of freedom while she had suffered not knowing what happened to her daughter. But there was also profound grief. No sentence could bring Kaylee back. No punishment imposed on Mark Christie could undo the loss Judy had endured. She had spent 2 years hoping against hope that Kaylee might still be alive somewhere, might still be found and returned home. Now, she knew with certainty that her daughter had been dead all along, killed within hours of her disappearance and hidden in a place where she might never have been found without Mark's confession. At least Judy finally had answers. She knew what had happened. She knew where Kaylee had been all that time. She could properly bury her daughter and begin trying to find some path forward through her grief. With Mark Christie in prison, investigators began to look more closely at his background and history. They wanted to understand who this man was, whether he had committed other crimes, and whether there were warning signs that had been missed. What they discovered was deeply troubling and suggested that Kaylee Poulton might not have been Mark's first victim. Detectives learned that in 1988, 6 years before Kaylee's murder, a brutal crime had occurred in a suburb of Rochester. A 74-year-old woman named Viola Manville had been attacked and murdered while taking a walk in her neighborhood. The murder of Viola Manville had been violent and shocking. She was an elderly woman, vulnerable and defenseless, attacked by someone who showed no mercy. The crime had terrified the community and put tremendous pressure on police to solve the case quickly. At the time of Viola's murder, investigators had developed several suspects. One of these suspects was a teenage boy named Mark Christie, who was only 16 years old at the time but who lived in the area where the murder occurred. Police brought Mark in for questioning about Viola Manville's death. The teenager was asked about his whereabouts at the time of the murder, whether he knew the victim, and whether he had any information about who might have killed her. Mark denied any involvement in Viola's death. He said he knew nothing about the murder and had no information that could help police solve the case. As part of the investigation, police asked Mark to take a polygraph test, just as they would later ask him to do in connection with Kaylee Poulton's disappearance. Mark agreed to the examination. The polygraph operator conducted the test and analyzed Mark's physiological responses to the questions about Viola Manville's murder. The operator concluded that Mark was showing no signs of deception. According to the polygraph results, Mark Christie was telling the truth when he said he was not involved in killing Viola Manville. Based on this polygraph result, police eliminated the 16-year-old Mark Christie as a suspect in Viola's murder. They turned their attention to other potential suspects in the case. Eventually, police arrested a man named Frank Sterling for Viola Manville's murder. Frank was a different individual with no apparent connection to Mark Christie, someone who had his own reasons for being considered a suspect in the case. When police first questioned Frank Sterling about Viola Manville's murder, he denied any involvement. He said he had not killed Viola and knew nothing about who had. He maintained his innocence consistently in the early stages of questioning. However, Frank was subjected to a relentless overnight interrogation. Hour after hour, detectives pressured him, accused him, told him they knew he was guilty, and demanded that he confess. The interrogation continued without significant breaks, wearing Frank down physically and mentally. By the end of this lengthy interrogation, Frank Sterling confessed to murdering Viola Manville. He provided details about the crime and admitted to being the person responsible for her death. Based on this confession, Frank was arrested, charged, and ultimately convicted of murder. He was sentenced to prison for killing Viola Manville, a crime that had horrified the Rochester community, but Frank Sterling maintained that his confession had been false, coerced through exhaustive interrogation techniques that left him confused, exhausted, and barely able to comprehend what was happening. He claimed that police had manipulated him into confessing to a crime he did not commit. From his prison cell, Frank tried repeatedly to appeal his sentence. He argued that his confession should not have been admitted as evidence because it had been obtained through coercion. He claimed that by the end of the overnight interrogation, he could barely think straight and would have said anything just to make the questioning stop. However, all of Frank Sterling's attempts to prove his innocence failed. Appeals courts upheld his conviction. His claims of a false confession were rejected. Year after year, Frank remained in prison for a murder he insisted he did not commit. Frank Sterling spent 19 years behind bars, maintaining his innocence but unable to prove it or secure his release. In 2010, Viola Manville's murder case was reopened as part of a review of old cases. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis technology, had made it possible to re-examine evidence from crimes that occurred decades earlier. All the existing physical evidence from Viola's murder was sent to a modern forensic laboratory for analysis. Technicians used current DNA testing methods that had not been available in 1988 when the murder occurred. The laboratory experts were able to extract a DNA sample from evidence collected at the crime scene. This DNA had presumably come from Viola's killer, perhaps from skin cells, hair, bodily fluids, or other biological material left behind during the violent attack. The forensic team compared this DNA sample to Frank Sterling's DNA. If Frank had indeed killed Viola Manville as he had confessed to doing, his DNA should match the sample found at the crime scene, but the results showed no match. The DNA found at Viola Manville's murder scene did not belong to Frank Sterling. This finding strongly suggested that Frank had been telling the truth for 19 years. He had not killed Viola, and his confession had indeed been false, coerced through aggressive interrogation tactics. The forensic experts then ran the unknown DNA sample through the FBI's national database, which contains DNA profiles from millions of individuals, including convicted criminals and prison inmates. They were searching for a match that might identify Viola's real killer. The search produced a hit. The DNA from Viola Manville's murder scene perfectly matched the DNA profile of another inmate currently serving time in a New York prison, Mark Christie. In 2011, at the age of 39, Mark Christie was confronted with the DNA evidence connecting him to Viola Manville's murder. After initially being questioned about the case 23 years earlier and passing a polygraph test, Mark now faced irrefutable scientific proof of his involvement. Given the strength of the DNA evidence, Mark confessed to killing Viola Manville. He admitted that he had murdered the 74-year-old woman when he was just 16 years old, years before he would go on to kill 4-year-old Kaylee Poulton. Mark received an additional 28 years in prison for Viola's murder, to be served on top of the 25-year minimum sentence he was already serving for killing Kaylee. This meant Mark Christie would likely spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. However, Mark did not provide details about his motives for killing Viola Manville. He did not explain why a 16-year-old boy would brutally murder an elderly woman out for a walk in her neighborhood. He showed no remorse for Viola's death or for the 19 years that an innocent man had spent in prison for a crime Mark himself had committed. This lack of remorse was consistent with Mark's overall behavior throughout both cases. Even when confessing to Detective Crow about Kaylee's murder, Mark had focused primarily on his own suffering. How seeing Kaylee's image had haunted him. How unfair it would be for him to spend 25 years in prison. How the past 2 years had been his personal hell. He had not expressed genuine empathy for his victims or their families. Frank Sterling was finally released from prison in 2010 after serving 19 years for a murder he did not commit. The DNA evidence had definitively proven his innocence and exposed the terrible injustice that had been done to him. Frank sued the authorities responsible for his wrongful conviction, the police department that had coerced his false confession, and the prosecutors who had built a case based on that confession despite its questionable origins. In 2014, Frank received a settlement of nearly $10 million as compensation for the 19 years of his life that had been stolen from him. The money was meant to acknowledge the profound injustice he had suffered and to provide him with financial security for whatever years he had remaining. But no amount of money could truly compensate Frank for what had been taken from him. 19 years, nearly 2 decades of his life, had been spent behind bars for a crime he did not commit. He had missed countless life experiences, opportunities, and moments with loved ones. He had endured the stigma of being labeled a murderer, the harsh conditions of prison, and the frustration of knowing he was innocent, but being unable to prove it. Tragically, Frank Sterling did not have many years to enjoy his freedom or his settlement. Just 3 years after his release from prison in 2017, Frank died of a heart attack at the age of 54. It is impossible to know whether the stress and trauma of his wrongful imprisonment contributed to his relatively early death, but the timing was heartbreaking. After enduring 19 years of injustice and finally being vindicated, Frank had only a brief window to live as a free man before his life ended. The revelation that Mark Christie had killed Viola Manville in 1988, 6 years before he killed Kaylee Poulton, raised troubling questions about missed opportunities that might have prevented Kaylee's death. If investigators in Viola Manville's case had not fixated so completely on Frank Sterling as their suspect, they might have looked more closely at other potential suspects, including the teenage Mark Christie. If they had not relied so heavily on Frank's coerced confession and had instead pursued forensic evidence and alternative theories, they might have identified Mark as the killer. If Mark had been arrested and convicted for Viola's murder in 1988 or 1989, he would have been in prison in May of 1994 when Kaylee Poulton disappeared. He would not have been living in that apartment complex in Rochester. He would not have had the opportunity to lure Kaylee into his home and kill her. In other words, the failure to properly investigate Viola Manville's murder and the rush to convict Frank Sterling based on a questionable confession had deadly consequences that extended far beyond Frank's wrongful imprisonment. That failure allowed a killer to remain free for another 6 years, during which time he took another innocent life. Additionally, there were warning signs about Mark Christie's behavior even before Kaylee's disappearance. Judy Poulton had reported his disturbing comments about watching little girls in the complex, his inappropriate question about whether Kaylee would tell her mother if someone touched her inappropriately, and other concerning behaviors. After Kaylee's disappearance, Mark had been reported for standing naked in his doorway in view of children in the complex, behavior that should have raised serious red flags about his potential danger to children. Yet no meaningful investigation of these reports was conducted, and Mark was simply allowed to move to a different city. If authorities had taken these warning signs more seriously, if they had maintained surveillance on Mark or investigated him more thoroughly after the reports of his inappropriate behavior, it is possible that additional evidence might have emerged linking him to Kaylee's disappearance before 2 years had passed. One particularly striking aspect of Mark Christie's criminal history was his ability to pass polygraph examinations despite being guilty of the crimes he was questioned about. In 1988, when questioned about Viola Manville's murder, 16-year-old Mark took a polygraph test and showed no signs of deception according to the examiner. Based largely on this result, he was eliminated as a suspect. In 1994, when questioned about Kaylee Poulton's disappearance, Mark again took a polygraph test and again showed no signs of deception. This result, combined with what appeared to be an alibi and the lack of physical evidence found in his apartment, led investigators to clear him as a suspect and focus their attention elsewhere. In both cases, Mark was guilty. He had murdered Viola Manville. He had murdered Kaylee Poulton. Yet in both cases, he successfully deceived the polygraph examination. This pattern illustrates an important limitation of polygraph testing that law enforcement professionals must keep in mind. While polygraphs can sometimes be useful investigative tools, they are far from infallible. Some individuals, particularly those with certain personality disorders, psychopathic traits, or simply strong emotional control, can lie during a polygraph examination without showing the physiological responses that the test is designed to detect. Mark Christie appeared to be one of these individuals. Whether through natural ability, practice, deception, or psychological characteristics that allowed him to feel no guilt or anxiety when lying, he was able to pass polygraph tests even when guilty of murder. Investigators who rely too heavily on polygraph results run the risk of eliminating guilty suspects or focusing too much attention on innocent ones, depending on how individuals respond to the testing process. The Kaylee Poulton case and the Viola Manville case together serve as cautionary examples of the dangers of treating polygraph results as definitive proof of innocence or guilt. Throughout the investigation and trial, and in the years since, Judy Poulton has remained an advocate for missing children and a voice for families who have endured similar tragedies. Her tireless efforts to keep Kaylee's case in the public eye, efforts that continued for 2 full years until Mark's confession, demonstrated the impact that determined family members can have on cold cases. Judy's refusal to give up, her creativity in finding new ways to publicize Kaylee's disappearance, and her persistence in demanding answers ultimately contributed to the resolution of the case. While it was Mark's confession to his wife that provided the initial break, that confession might never have occurred if Judy had not kept the case so prominently in public consciousness. Mark himself admitted in his confession to Detective Crowe that he constantly saw Kaylee's face on flyers, billboards, and television. This constant reminder of what he had done apparently weighed on him psychologically, contributing to the stress in his marriage, and perhaps making him more likely to confess to his wife during their argument. In this way, Judy's advocacy directly contributed to solving her daughter's case. Her work ensured that Mark Christie could not simply move on with his life and forget what he had done. Every time he saw Kaylee's face on a flyer or a billboard, he was confronted with his crime. Judy's experience has also provided important lessons for other families of missing children. Her case demonstrates the value of sustained public awareness campaigns, the importance of working cooperatively with media outlets, and the potential impact of keeping a case visible even when official investigations have stalled. Mark Christie continues to serve his prison sentence in a New York correctional facility. He is now serving time for 2 murders: Kaylee Poulton's death, for which he received a minimum of 25 years, and Viola Manville's death, for which he received an additional 28 years. Given these sentences and the timing of his convictions, Mark may theoretically become eligible for parole consideration at some point in the future, likely when he is elderly if he lives that long. However, there are absolutely no guarantees that he will actually be released. Parole boards in New York consider multiple factors when evaluating whether to release an inmate, including the severity of the original crime, the inmate's behavior while incarcerated, whether the inmate has shown genuine remorse and rehabilitation, and whether the inmate poses a continued danger to society. In Mark's case, several factors work strongly against the likelihood of parole being granted. He committed 2 murders, including the murder of a 4-year-old child. He showed no remorse for either crime, providing only self-centered justifications focused on his own suffering. He has demonstrated a pattern of violence spanning from age 16 to age 22 and targeting vulnerable victims, including an elderly woman and a young child. Additionally, Mark's ability to deceive polygraph examinations, to maintain a facade of normalcy while hiding terrible crimes, and to manipulate his way through police investigations suggests a level of calculation and lack of empathy that would concern any parole board evaluating whether he could safely be released back into society. For these Reasons: while Mark may eventually become eligible for parole hearings, it seems unlikely that he will actually be released. He will likely spend the remainder of his life in prison, the fate he feared and complained about to Detective Crow, but a fate he brought upon himself through his own actions. The Kaylee Poulton case and its connection to the Viola Manville case highlight several systemic failures in the criminal justice system that had tragic consequences. First, the investigation of Viola Manville's murder demonstrated the dangers of confirmation bias and tunnel vision in police investigations. Once investigators focused on Frank Sterling as their primary suspect, they stopped seriously considering other possibilities. They subjected Frank to aggressive interrogation tactics designed to obtain a confession rather than to discover the truth. When Frank finally confessed after hours of relentless questioning, investigators treated this confession as definitive proof of guilt rather than considering the possibility that it might have been coerced. They did not adequately pursue forensic evidence or alternative suspects. This single-minded focus on obtaining and preserving Frank's conviction meant that the real killer, Mark Christie, remained free. Second, the case revealed weaknesses in how polygraph examinations are used in criminal investigations. Mark Christie passed 2 separate polygraph tests despite being guilty of murder in both instances. Investigators placed too much weight on these results, using them as primary reasons to eliminate Mark as a suspect rather than treating them as just one piece of information among many. Third, the investigation of Kaylee's disappearance showed gaps in how police search for missing children and evidence. Mark Christie exploited what he saw as a loophole. The fact that police searching for a missing child would only look in places where a child could fit, not in places where evidence might be hidden. While this limitation makes sense given the urgent need to find a living child quickly, it meant that Kaylee's tricycle remained undetected despite being in Mark's apartment during the search. Fourth, the case highlighted failures in how warning signs of dangerous behavior are investigated and acted upon. Mark Christie exhibited multiple red flags: inappropriate comments about children, suspicious questions to Kaylee's mother, reports of exhibitionist behavior, yet no coordinated effort was made to investigate whether he posed a danger to the community. He was allowed to simply move to another city and continue his life without serious scrutiny. Understanding Mark Christie's psychology provides important insights into how such crimes occur and how similar offenders might be identified before they can harm victims. Mark's criminal history reveals a pattern of predatory behavior that began in his teenage years and continued into early adulthood. His first known victim, Viola Manville, was a 74-year-old woman, vulnerable due to her age and physical limitations. His second known victim, Kaylee Poulton, was a 4-year-old child, vulnerable due to her youth and innocence. Both victims were chosen specifically because of their vulnerability. Mark selected people who could not effectively resist him, who could not overpower him, who could not defend themselves. This pattern of targeting the most defenseless members of society suggests an offender who is fundamentally predatory in nature. Mark's behavior also demonstrated significant premeditation and calculation. His disposal of Kaylee's tricycle showed careful planning. He understood the legal limitations on police searches and exploited those limitations to hide evidence. His method of disposing of Kaylee's body required him to transport her from his apartment to his workplace and to utilize his knowledge of the facility to find a hiding place where she might never be discovered. This level of planning contradicts Mark's later claim that Kaylee's death was a spontaneous act committed in a moment of panic. The evidence suggests instead that Mark was capable of thinking clearly even in high-stress situations, of calculating risks and probabilities, and of taking deliberate steps to avoid detection. Mark's ability to pass polygraph examinations while lying about murders he had committed is particularly revealing. Research on psychopathy and related personality disorders has shown that some individuals have reduced emotional responses to lying and feel little or no anxiety when deceiving others. This can make them particularly difficult to detect through methods like polygraph testing that rely on measuring stress responses. Mark's lack of genuine remorse throughout both cases is another indicator of possible psychopathic traits. When he confessed to Detective Crow, his primary concerns were about his own suffering, his own future, his own family. He asked what sentence he might face, complained that 25 years would be unfair to him, and talked about his own personal hell over the past 2 years. Nowhere in his confession did Mark express authentic empathy for Kaylee, for Judy Poulton's suffering, or for the pain he had inflicted on an innocent family. His statement that Killing Kaylee was a mistake framed the murder as an error in judgment, affecting primarily himself rather than as a horrific act of violence against a defenseless child. Similarly, when Mark eventually confessed to murdering Viola Manville, he did not disclose his motives or show remorse for her death or for the 19 years that Frank Sterling had spent in prison for his crime. He appeared to view his victims as objects, not as people deserving of empathy or consideration. The trauma that Judy Poulton experienced through Kaylee's disappearance, the 2-year search, and the eventual discovery of the truth about her. Daughter's murder cannot be overstated. Her ordeal represents one of the most painful experiences a parent can endure. For the first 2 years after Kaylee vanished, Judy lived in a state of tortured uncertainty. She did not know if her daughter was alive or dead, suffering or safe, being held somewhere or lost forever. This ambiguous loss is particularly difficult to process psychologically because there is no closure, no finality that would allow grief to begin resolving. During this period, Judy invested every ounce of her energy into searching for Kaylee. She left her job, devoted her time to advocacy and awareness campaigns, contacted media outlets repeatedly, and worked tirelessly to keep Kaylee's face in the public eye. This work gave Judy a sense of purpose and hope, but it also meant she could never rest, never stop, never allow herself to fully process the trauma of what had happened. When Mark Christie finally confessed and Kaylee's body was recovered, Judy had to confront a new form of pain. The desperate hope she had clung to for 2 years was extinguished. She learned that Kaylee had been dead since the evening she disappeared, killed within a short time after being lured into Mark's apartment. Judy also had to confront the terrible knowledge of how Kaylee died, strangled by someone she knew, someone who lived in their complex, someone Judy had warned Kaylee about. She had to imagine her daughter's final moments, the fear Kaylee must have felt, the betrayal of being harmed by an adult she had trusted enough to enter his home. Additionally, Judy learned that Kaylee's body had been hidden in a place she might never have been found if Mark had not confessed. The liquid coolant tank at Mark's workplace was not a location that would have come up in a normal investigation. Without Mark's voluntary disclosure of this information, Kaylee might have remained a missing person indefinitely, and Judy might have spent the rest of her life not knowing what had happened to her daughter. In some ways, this knowledge brought relief. Judy finally had answers and could properly bury Kaylee. But it also brought new pain as she realized just how close she had come to never knowing the truth, never having closure, never being able to lay her daughter to rest. The impact of this trauma extends beyond the immediate emotional pain. Research on parents who lose children to violence shows elevated rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated grief, and physical health problems. Many parents struggle with guilt, wondering if they could have done something differently to prevent their child's death. In Judy's case, she might have struggled with questions about whether she should have been more suspicious of Mark Christie earlier, whether she should have reported his behavior to police before Kaylee disappeared, whether she should not have let Kaylee go outside that evening. While none of these thoughts are rational, Mark Christie alone bore responsibility for his actions. They are common among parents who have lost children to violence. The Kaylee Poulton case has implications that extend beyond this individual tragedy and touch on larger issues within the criminal justice system and society's approach to protecting children. One significant implication relates to how police conduct searches for missing children and evidence. Mark Christie was able to hide Kaylee's tricycle in his apartment during the initial police search by exploiting what he perceived as a loophole. The fact that police searching for a missing child would only look in places where a child could fit. This case has led to discussions within law enforcement about search protocols when a child goes missing. While the urgent need to find a living child quickly necessarily drives initial search priorities, there may be value in conducting secondary, more thorough searches for evidence once all potential hiding places for a child have been checked. Another implication relates to the use of polygraph examinations in investigations. Mark Christie's ability to pass 2 separate polygraph tests while guilty of murder demonstrates the limitations of this technology. While polygraphs can be useful investigative tools in some contexts, the Christie case serves as a reminder that they should never be treated as definitive proof of innocence or guilt. Law enforcement agencies may need to reconsider how much weight they place on polygraph results, particularly when other evidence or behavioral indicators suggest a person may be involved in a crime. A past polygraph should not automatically eliminate someone as a suspect if other factors point towards their involvement. The case also highlights the importance of taking warning signs seriously when someone exhibits inappropriate behavior toward children. Mark Christie made disturbing comments about watching little girls, asked inappropriate questions about child sexual abuse, and was reported for exhibitionist behavior, yet no meaningful investigation of these red flags occurred. Communities and law enforcement agencies might benefit from better systems for tracking and investigating such warning signs, even when they do not rise to the level of clear criminal activity. While civil liberties concerns must be balanced against public safety, there may be intermediate steps that could be taken when someone exhibits concerning behavior without yet having committed a prosecutable offense. Judy Poulton's experience and advocacy offer several important lessons for families of missing children and for communities working to protect children from predators. First, Judy's tireless publicity campaign demonstrates that families can play a crucial role in keeping cases alive and in public consciousness. While some families may not have the resources, energy, or inclination to conduct the kind of sustained media campaign that Judy organized, her case shows that such efforts can make a real difference. The constant visibility of Kaylee's case through flyers, billboards, television appearances, and other media kept pressure on investigators and also created psychological pressure on Mark Christie himself. His own confession to Detective Crow revealed that seeing Kaylee's face everywhere had haunted him and contributed to his emotional state. Second, Judy's case illustrates the importance of trusting parental instincts when someone's behavior toward children seems inappropriate. Judy felt uncomfortable about Mark Christie's comments and questions from the beginning. She made the decision to keep Kaylee away from Mark and his family based on these gut feelings. While this caution ultimately did not prevent Kaylee's death, because Mark deliberately created an opportunity to get her alone, Judy's instincts about Mark were entirely correct. He was dangerous, he was predatory, and he did pose a threat to children. Parents who notice similar warning signs in other adults should trust those instincts and take appropriate protective measures. Third, the case demonstrates the value of community involvement in searching for missing children. When Kaylee disappeared, neighbors immediately joined the search effort, and community members later helped Judy distribute flyers and raise reward money. This collective action, while ultimately unable to prevent the tragic outcome, showed the power of communities coming together to support families in crisis. Fourth, Judy's experience shows that even when official investigations stall or go cold, families should not give up hope for answers. For 2 years, police had no new leads and no progress in Kaylee's case. A family with less determination might have resigned themselves to never knowing what happened. But Judy's refusal to give up meant that when the break in the case finally came through Mark's confession to his wife, there was immediate renewed attention and action. While no system can perfectly prevent all crimes against children, the Kaylee Poulton case and the Viola Manville case together suggest several areas where improvements might reduce the risk of similar tragedies. First, there is a need for better training in interrogation techniques and confession evaluation. The false confession obtained from Frank Sterling in the Viola Manville case shows the dangers of coercive interrogation methods. When police subject suspects to relentless overnight questioning designed to break down their resistance, they risk obtaining false confessions from innocent people while allowing guilty parties to escape justice. Law enforcement agencies should emphasize interrogation approaches that seek truth rather than simply seeking confessions. Recording all interrogations from beginning to end can help courts evaluate whether confessions were obtained through appropriate means. Understanding the psychology of false confessions can help investigators recognize when a confession may be unreliable. Second, improvements in forensic science should be applied not only to new cases but also to old ones. The DNA analysis that eventually identified Mark Christie as Viola Manville's killer and exonerated Frank Sterling occurred more than 20 years after the murder. This delay meant that Mark remained free to kill again and that Frank spent 19 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Many jurisdictions have established conviction integrity units or innocence projects that systematically review old cases using modern forensic techniques. Expanding these efforts and prioritizing cases where there are doubts about the original conviction could help identify other instances where innocent people have been wrongly imprisoned and guilty parties remain free. Third, there is a need for better systems to identify, track, and respond to individuals who exhibit warning signs of potential danger to children. Mark Christie made inappropriate comments about children, asked suspicious questions, and engaged in exhibitionist behavior, all before Kaylee's murder. Yet these warning signs were not aggregated, analyzed, or acted upon in any systematic way. While protecting civil liberties and avoiding false accusations is crucial, there may be ways to better monitor individuals who exhibit multiple red flags without necessarily subjecting them to criminal prosecution. This might include increased attention from Child Protective Services, closer scrutiny if they seek employment or volunteer positions involving children, or informal monitoring by community members who have been made aware of concerns. Fourth, education about predatory behavior could help community members recognize warning signs earlier. Many people do not know what grooming behavior looks like, what questions or comments from adults should raise concerns, or how predators typically operate within communities. Public. Education campaigns about child safety might help more people recognize suspicious behavior and report it appropriately. One of the most unusual aspects of the Kaylee Poulton case was the initial complication created by spousal privilege laws. When Mark Christie confessed to his wife that he had killed Kaylee, that confession could not be used against him in court because communications between spouses are legally protected in New York and many other jurisdictions. This legal principle created a frustrating situation where police knew Mark was guilty but could not immediately arrest him or use his confession as evidence. Only through Detective Crow's skillful interviewing and Mark's decision to confess directly to police was the spousal privilege obstacle overcome. The Christie case raises questions about whether spousal privilege should protect confessions to serious crimes, particularly crimes against children. The principle behind spousal privilege is sound, encouraging open communication between married partners and recognizing the special bond of marriage. But when that privilege protects a child killer from prosecution, it creates a tension between these policy goals and the public interest in justice and safety. Some jurisdictions have carved out exceptions to spousal privilege for certain types of cases, particularly those involving crimes against children or domestic violence. The reasoning is that while spousal privilege serves important purposes in most contexts, it should not become a shield for the most serious crimes or create situations where victims cannot get justice. However, any modifications to spousal privilege must be carefully considered. If spouses know that their communications might be used against their partners in criminal proceedings, it could fundamentally change the nature of marital relationships and create incentives for spouses to remain silent about crimes rather than encouraging confession and reform. In the Kaylee Poulton case, the spousal privilege issue ultimately did not prevent justice from being served because Detective Crow successfully obtained a direct confession from Mark Christie. But the case illustrates how close Mark came to escaping prosecution due to this legal protection, which could inform ongoing debates about the proper scope and limitations of spousal privilege. The decades-long span of the Viola Manville and Kaylee Poulton cases, from Viola's murder in 1988 to Mark's conviction for both crimes in the 2010s, encompasses a period of tremendous advancement in investigative techniques and forensic science. When Viola Manville was murdered in 1988, DNA analysis was still in its relative infancy as a forensic tool. The technique had only been developed in the mid-1980s, and many law enforcement agencies did not yet have the capacity or expertise to collect and analyze DNA evidence effectively. By the time Viola's case was reopened in 2010, DNA analysis had become a standard and highly sophisticated forensic tool. The ability to extract DNA from old evidence, to analyze degraded samples, to search databases containing millions of profiles, and to make definitive matches had advanced dramatically. This technological progress made it possible to definitively prove that Frank Sterling had not killed Viola Manville, and to identify Mark Christie as the actual perpetrator. Without these advances in forensic science, Frank might have died in prison for a crime he did not commit, and Mark might never have been connected to Viola's murder. The case also demonstrates the value of maintaining physical evidence from old cases even when they appear to have been solved. The biological material that eventually proved Frank's innocence and identified Mark as the killer had been preserved since 1988. If that evidence had been discarded after Frank's conviction on the theory that the case was closed, the truth might never have emerged. Many law enforcement agencies now have policies requiring the long-term preservation of biological evidence, even from cases that have resulted in convictions. The Viola Manville case provides a powerful example of why such policies are important. Forensic technology will likely continue advancing, and evidence that cannot be analyzed effectively today might provide crucial answers in the future. The extensive media coverage of Kaylee Poulton's disappearance, driven largely by Judy's advocacy efforts, played a complex role in the case's eventual resolution. On one hand, the constant visibility of Kaylee's case kept public attention focused on finding her and maintained pressure on investigators to continue working the case even as it went cold. The media coverage also created the psychological pressure on Mark Christie that he later described in his confession, the constant reminders of what he had done as he saw Kaylee's face on flyers, billboards, and television. On the other hand, there are legitimate questions about whether media attention can sometimes hinder investigations or create problems for the families of missing children. Extensive coverage can generate thousands of tips that investigators must follow up on, many of which are well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful. Media attention can also intrude on family privacy during an already traumatic time. In Kaylee's case, Judy actively sought media coverage and made it a central part of her search strategy, so the privacy concerns were less significant. And while the thousands of tips generated by media coverage did require investigative resources to pursue, they kept the case active and visible in ways that might have been impossible otherwise. The case demonstrates that, particularly for families of missing children, strategic use of media can be a powerful tool for keeping cases alive and maintaining public engagement. The specific tactics Judy employed, appearing on national television shows, convincing airlines to include flyers with tickets, working with businesses to display information on commercial vehicles, showed creativity and persistence that maximized the impact of her efforts. One troubling question that remains unanswered is whether Viola Manville and Kaylee Poulton were Mark Christie's only victims, or whether there might be other crimes he committed that have not been discovered or connected to him. Mark killed Viola when he was 16 years old in 1988. He killed Kaylee when he was 22 years old in 1994. That 6-year gap raises the question of whether Mark committed other offenses during that period or in the years between Kaylee's death and his eventual arrest. Serial offenders often do not stop killing voluntarily. They continue until they are caught, die, or become physically unable to continue. The fact that Mark killed twice, with the victims being very different in age and vulnerability, suggests an offender who is opportunistic and predatory rather than having a specific victim type. Mark's inappropriate behavior toward children in the apartment complex, his exhibitionist conduct, and his ability to deceive during interrogations and polygraph tests all suggest someone who was actively engaged in predatory behavior and who might have committed other offenses that were not detected or not reported. However, there is no definitive evidence connecting Mark to any other unsolved crimes. When he was arrested and his background investigated more thoroughly, authorities looked for connections to other cases without finding any clear links. It is possible that Viola and Kaylee were his only murder victims, that his crimes were more opportunistic than compulsive, committed when circumstances aligned and when he felt he could get away with them. It is also possible that he committed other crimes that have not been discovered or that have been attributed to other offenders or written off as accidents or disappearances. This uncertainty is one of the frustrating realities of investigating serial offenders. Unless the offender confesses to additional crimes, or unless physical evidence definitively connects them to other cases, there may always be questions about the full extent of their criminal history. The resolution of the Kaylee Poulton case and the Viola Manville case brings into focus complex questions about justice, punishment, and the meaning of closure for families who have lost loved ones to violence. For Judy Poulton, seeing Mark Christie convicted and sentenced to decades in prison provided a form of justice, acknowledgement that what happened to Kaylee was a crime, that the perpetrator had been identified, and that he would face consequences for his actions. The criminal justice system functioned as it was designed to, ultimately holding Mark accountable, but this legal justice could not restore what Judy had lost. No sentence imposed on Mark Christie could bring Kaylee back to life. No amount of time Mark spent in prison could undo the trauma Judy experienced during the 2 years she searched for her daughter, not knowing if Kaylee was alive or dead. No guilty verdict could erase the pain of learning how Kaylee died or the knowledge that she suffered in her final moments. This gap between legal justice and restorative justice is inherent in cases of serious violence, particularly homicide. The criminal justice system can punish perpetrators, remove dangerous individuals from society, and send messages about what behavior will not be tolerated. But it cannot make victims or their families whole again. It cannot restore what was taken or repair what was broken. For Frank Sterling, who spent 19 years in prison for a murder he did not commit, the resolution of Viola Manville's case brought vindication and financial compensation. Although the legal system acknowledged its error, released him from prison, and provided monetary damages for the years of his life that were stolen. But again, this legal resolution could not fully restore what Frank lost. 19 years cannot be returned to him. The opportunities he missed, the relationships that were damaged or destroyed, the stigma he endured as a convicted murderer, the trauma of wrongful imprisonment, none of these things could be undone by his exoneration or his financial settlement. Frank's death just 3 years after his release from prison adds another layer of tragedy to his story. After fighting for nearly 2 decades to prove his innocence, he had only a brief period to enjoy his freedom before his life ended. These cases together illustrate both the importance of the criminal justice system in holding offenders accountable and its fundamental limitations in addressing the full scope of harm that serious crimes create. Mark Christie's pattern of violent crime from age 16 through age 22 raises questions about criminal recidivism and whether anything could have been done after Viola Manville's murder to prevent Kaylee Poulton's murder. Because Mark was never charged with Viola's murder at the time it occurred, there was no intervention that might have interrupted his pattern of offending. He was questioned as a teenager, took a polygraph test, was cleared as a suspect, and then continued his life without any criminal justice system involvement related to that case. From law enforcement's perspective at the time, Mark Christie was not a known offender. He had no criminal record. He was not on anyone's radar as a potential danger. There was no reason for authorities to monitor him or to take any preventive action. This situation highlights a challenge in preventing violent crime. First-time offenders are, by definition, not in the criminal justice system yet. There are no prior convictions to point to, no pattern of escalating behavior that has come to official attention, no clear indicators that would justify intervention. However, Mark did exhibit warning signs that might have been noticed and acted upon even without a criminal conviction. His inappropriate comments about children, his suspicious questions to Kaylee's mother, and his exhibitionist behavior all suggested someone with problematic attitudes and behaviors regarding children. The question is whether these warning signs, which did not individually rise to the level of criminal acts, could or should have triggered some form of intervention or increased scrutiny. This is a difficult question that involves balancing public safety against individual privacy and civil liberties. In a society that values freedom and due process, we generally do not subject people to significant restrictions or intrusions based solely on behavior that makes others uncomfortable or that raises vague concerns. We require evidence of actual criminal conduct before imposing serious consequences, but this approach means that truly dangerous individuals may have opportunities to offend before they come to the attention of law enforcement in a meaningful way. By the time the criminal justice system intervenes, victims have already been harmed. Some jurisdictions have experimented with threat assessment approaches that try to identify individuals who pose risks before they commit serious violence. These approaches are controversial and raise concerns about false positives, privacy violations, and potential abuses. But they reflect attempts to grapple with the challenge of preventing violence from first-time offenders. Beyond the formal criminal justice system, the Kaylee Poulton case suggests several community-level strategies that might help protect children from predators. First, the case demonstrates the value of neighbors looking out for one another and for one another's children. The residents of Kaylee's apartment complex quickly joined. Judy's search when Kaylee disappeared. They provided information to police. They wanted to help. This kind of community cohesion and mutual support can serve protective functions. When neighbors know one another and pay attention to what is happening in their community, unusual or suspicious behavior is more likely to be noticed and reported. However, there are limits to what informal community monitoring can accomplish. Mark Christie lived among these neighbors, appeared normal, maintained a family, and went to work. His outward presentation did not obviously mark him as dangerous. Even Judy Poulton's concerns about his comments and questions, while valid, were not so extreme that they clearly indicated he was a murderer. Second, the case illustrates the importance of teaching children about body safety, appropriate and inappropriate touch, and how to report concerning behavior by adults. Kaylee was only 4 years old when she was killed, very young to have had extensive safety education, but older children who understand these concepts may be better able to recognize grooming behavior or inappropriate advances and to report them to trusted adults. Child safety education must be age appropriate and delivered in ways that empower children without traumatizing them or making them fearful of all adults. The goal is to give children knowledge and language to identify and report concerning situations, not to create anxiety or paranoia. Third, the case underscores the need for adults to be aware of grooming tactics that predators use to gain access to children and to normalize inappropriate behavior. Mark Christie's strategy of allowing Kaylee to play with his son created opportunities for him to interact with her in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. Adults who understand grooming tactics may be better able to recognize when someone is inappropriately seeking access to children, creating situations to be alone with children, or working to establish trust and familiarity as a precursor to abuse. Fourth, institutions that serve children, schools, daycare centers, youth programs, religious organizations need robust screening and monitoring procedures for staff and volunteers. While these procedures cannot catch every potential offender, they create barriers that may deter some individuals and identify others before they have opportunities to harm children. Background checks, reference checks, training requirements, supervision protocols, and clear reporting procedures all contribute to creating safer environments for children. No system is perfect, but layered protections can significantly reduce risks. Detective Crow's success in obtaining a confession from Mark Christie, despite Mark having passed a polygraph test years earlier, and despite the legal protection afforded by spousal privilege, provides insights into the psychology of confession and effective interrogation techniques. Crow's approach was notably non-confrontational and empathetic. Rather than aggressively accusing Mark or pressuring him, Crow adopted a friendly, understanding tone. He met Mark in a neutral location, a restaurant rather than a police station. He framed their conversation as an informal chat rather than a formal interrogation. This approach served several purposes. It made Mark feel more comfortable and less defensive. It appealed to Mark's ego by acknowledging his cleverness in evading detection. It created an atmosphere where Mark felt he was in control and could choose what to share rather than being coerced. Crow also used tactical empathy, suggesting that perhaps Kaylee's death was an accident rather than deliberate murder, acknowledging Mark's suffering over the past 2 years and treating him as a person rather than simply as a suspect. This approach gave Mark ways to rationalize his confession and to feel that the detective understood his perspective. Importantly, Crow was honest with Mark about the limitations of the legal situation. He explained that if Mark spoke with his lawyer, the lawyer would prohibit him from confessing. He pointed out that this would mean Kaylee's family would never know what happened. This honesty, rather than deception, created trust and also framed Mark's decision as a choice between doing the right thing and protecting himself. This interrogation approach contrasts sharply with the methods used to obtain Frank Sterling's false confession in the Viola Manville case. Frank was subjected to relentless overnight questioning designed to break down his resistance. The interrogation was confrontational, aggressive, and exhausting. Ultimately, it produced a confession, but the confession was false, given by an innocent man who was confused, exhausted, and desperate to make the interrogation stop. The contrast between these two interrogations illustrates an important principle. Interrogation techniques that focus on building rapport, demonstrating respect, and seeking truth are more likely to produce reliable information than techniques that rely on pressure, exhaustion, and coercion. Modern interrogation training increasingly emphasizes rapport-based approaches over confrontational methods. Research has shown that confrontational interrogation techniques not only risk producing false confessions from innocent people, but may also make guilty suspects less likely to provide truthful information. Detective Crow's success with Mark Christie demonstrates the potential effectiveness of these more humane and psychologically sophisticated approaches to interrogation. For Judy Poulton and others affected by Kaylee's murder, the question of how to heal and move forward after such profound trauma has no simple answers. Grief over the loss of a child is one of the most painful experiences a human being can endure. When that loss occurs through violence, and when it is preceded by years of uncertainty about what happened, the grief becomes even more complicated and difficult to process. Judy's intensive activism during the 2 years she searched for Kaylee likely served multiple psychological functions. It gave her a sense of purpose and agency during a time when she felt powerless. It allowed her to feel that she was doing everything possible to find her daughter. It provided a focus for her energy that may have helped her manage overwhelming emotions. But this intensive activity may also have delayed Judy's grief process. As long as she was actively searching for Kaylee, she could maintain hope that Kaylee might still be found alive. She did not have to fully confront the possibility that her daughter was dead. When Mark Christie finally confessed and that hope was definitively ended, Judy had to begin processing 2 years' worth of accumulated grief. Mental health professionals who work with families of murder victims often emphasize that there is no right way to grieve and no predetermined timeline for healing. Each person's journey through grief is unique and influenced by countless individual factors. Some common elements that can support healing include having a supportive community of family and friends, engaging with support groups of others who have experienced similar losses, working with mental health professionals who specialize in trauma and grief, finding meaningful ways to honor the memory of the lost loved one, and allowing oneself to experience the full range of emotions that grief brings without judgment. For some people, advocacy work similar to what Judy did during her search becomes an ongoing way to find meaning and purpose after loss. Parents of murdered children have started organizations to support other grieving families, have worked to change laws related to child safety or criminal justice, have created scholarships or programs in their children's names, or have found other ways to create positive legacies from terrible tragedies. There is no requirement that anyone do such work. Healing can take many forms, and some people find their path forward through quieter, more private means. But for those who feel called to it, advocacy and activism can be powerful tools for processing grief and honoring lost loved ones. The Kaylee Poulton case and the Viola Manville case have contributed to ongoing conversations about needed reforms in the criminal justice system, particularly regarding how missing children cases are investigated and how potential wrongful convictions are identified and corrected. In the area of missing children investigations, the case has informed discussions about search protocols, evidence collection, and the importance of maintaining open lines of investigation even when certain suspects have been cleared. Mark Christie's ability to hide Kaylee's tricycle during the initial police search by exploiting the limitations of searches focused only on finding the child herself has led to considerations of how to conduct more comprehensive evidence searches while still prioritizing the urgent need to find missing children quickly. Some jurisdictions have adopted protocols that involve initial rapid searches focused solely on finding the child, followed by more methodical evidence-focused searches if the child is not quickly located. This approach tries to balance the competing needs of speed and thoroughness. The case also highlights the importance of not relying too heavily on any single investigative tool, including polygraph examinations. Mark Christie's ability to pass polygraph tests while guilty has contributed to broader skepticism about treating polygraph results as definitive indicators of truthfulness. Many law enforcement agencies now train investigators to view polygraph results as just one piece of information among many, not as conclusive proof of innocence or guilt. In the area of wrongful conviction prevention, Frank Sterling's 19-year imprisonment for a murder he did not commit has reinforced the importance of several key reforms. The case demonstrates the dangers of coercive interrogation techniques and the reality of false confessions, a phenomenon that many people find difficult to believe but that research has shown occurs with disturbing frequency. Many jurisdictions now require that interrogations be recorded from beginning to end, providing a complete record that courts can review to determine whether confessions were obtained appropriately. This practice helps protect both suspects from coercive tactics and law enforcement from false allegations of misconduct. The case also underscores the critical importance of preserving biological evidence even after cases have been resolved through conviction. The DNA evidence that eventually exonerated Frank Sterling and identified Mark Christie as Viola's killer had been preserved since 1988. Without that preservation, the truth might never have emerged. Many states have now passed laws requiring the preservation of biological evidence in serious cases for extended periods, sometimes indefinitely. These laws recognize that forensic science continues to advance and that evidence that cannot be analyzed effectively today might provide crucial answers in the future. Additionally, the case supports the value of conviction integrity units and innocence projects that systematically review questionable convictions. Frank Sterling maintained his innocence for 19 years before the reopening of his case and the DNA analysis that proved him right. Without institutional mechanisms for reviewing potentially wrongful convictions, innocent people can languish in prison while guilty parties remain free. The use of DNA database searching to connect Mark Christie to Viola Manville's murder represents an important development in forensic investigation that has revolutionized how law enforcement solves cold cases. When Viola was murdered in 1988, DNA databases did not exist. Even if investigators had successfully collected DNA evidence from the crime scene, they would have had no way to search for a match unless they already had a specific suspect to test against. By 2010, when Viola's case was reopened, law enforcement had access to CODIS, the combined DNA index system maintained by the FBI. This database contains DNA profiles from millions of individuals, including convicted offenders, arrestees in some jurisdictions, and evidence from unsolved crimes. The ability to take DNA from an old crime scene and search it against this massive database dramatically changes the landscape of cold case investigation. Cases that were effectively unsolvable using traditional investigative methods can now be resolved through database searching. Mark Christie's DNA was in the database because he had been convicted of murdering Kaylee Poulton and was serving time in prison. When the DNA from Viola Manville's murder scene was searched against the database, it matched his profile, instantly connecting him to a murder committed years earlier. This case illustrates the power of DNA databases to solve multiple crimes through a single database hit. By identifying Mark as Viola's killer, investigators not only solved a cold case but also exonerated an innocent man who had been wrongly imprisoned. However, DNA databases also raise privacy concerns and civil liberties questions. Who should have their DNA included in such databases? Should it only be convicted offenders, or should arrestees also be included even if they are never convicted? What safeguards are needed to prevent misuse of this genetic information? How long should DNA profiles be retained? Different jurisdictions have answered these questions differently, balancing law enforcement interests against privacy concerns. The Viola Manville case provides a powerful example of how DNA databases can serve justice, but it does not resolve all the complex ethical and policy questions these technologies raise. The experiences of Judy Poulton, Frank Sterling, and the family of Viola Manville highlight the importance of victim advocacy and victim rights within the criminal justice system. For much of its history, the American criminal justice system treated crime primarily as an offense against the state rather than against individual victims. Prosecutors represented the interests of the government, defense attorneys represented the accused, but no one specifically represented the interests of victims and their families. This approach often left victims and their families feeling marginalized, powerless, and ignored within the very system that was supposed to provide them justice. They might not be informed about important developments in cases, might have no say in plea negotiations, might not be allowed to speak at sentencing hearings, and might receive little support or assistance. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing through subsequent decades, a victims' rights movement gained momentum, advocating for laws and policies that would give victims and their families a greater voice in the criminal justice process. Today, most states have laws guaranteeing certain rights to crime victims, such as the right to be notified of important proceedings and developments, the right to be present at court hearings, the right to be heard at sentencing, the right to restitution from the offenders, and the right to be treated with dignity and respect throughout the process. Judy Poulton's experience with the criminal justice system occurred during a period when victim rights were being strengthened but were not yet as robust as they would later become. Her tireless advocacy not only helped keep Kaylee's case in the public eye, but also represented a mother fighting to ensure that her daughter was not forgotten and that justice would be pursued. Frank Sterling's experience as a victim of wrongful conviction represents another dimension of victim rights. People who are wrongly convicted are victims of the criminal justice system itself. They deserve not only exoneration and release, but also compensation, support services, and public acknowledgement of the injustice they suffered. The nearly $10 million that Frank received in his settlement represented recognition that the system had failed him catastrophically. While no amount of money could truly compensate for 19 years of wrongful imprisonment, the settlement at least provided some tangible acknowledgement of the harm done to him. For Viola Manville's family, the eventual identification of her real killer and the exoneration of the wrong man brought a complex mix of emotions. There may have been relief that the truth had finally emerged, but also renewed grief over Viola's death and perhaps anger that the real killer had gone free for so long. The Kaylee Poulton case occurred within a broader social context of heightened awareness about child safety and stranger danger that characterized the 1990s and continues to influence how Americans think about risks to children. During this period, high-profile child abduction cases received extensive media coverage, contributing to widespread fear among parents about the safety of their children. Images of missing children appeared on milk cartons, in grocery stores, and in public service announcements. Parents became more cautious about letting children play unsupervised and more vigilant about potential threats. This heightened awareness had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, it likely led to children being taught more about body safety and appropriate versus inappropriate behavior by adults. It may have made potential predators more cautious about approaching children. It encouraged communities to be more watchful and protective. On the negative side, the intense focus on stranger danger sometimes obscured the reality that children are statistically much more likely to be harmed by someone they know, a family member, family friend, or trusted authority figure, than by a stranger. The fear of stranger abduction also contributed to decreased independence for children, with parents feeling they could not allow children the same freedom to play outside unsupervised that previous generations had enjoyed. Mark Christie represents a category of offender that complicates the stranger danger narrative. He was not a complete stranger to Kaylee. He was a neighbor, someone Kaylee had seen before, someone whose child she had played with. He used this familiarity to gain Kaylee's trust and lure her into his apartment. This pattern is actually quite common in child abduction and abuse cases. Offenders often establish some relationship or connection with potential victims before making their move. They may position themselves in roles that give them access to children as coaches, teachers, youth leaders, neighbors, or family friends. They use this access to groom children, build trust, and create opportunities. Understanding this reality is important for effective child protection strategies. While teaching children not to talk to strangers has value, it is equally or more important to teach children that even known adults should not ask them to do certain things, should not touch them in certain ways, and should not ask them to keep secrets. The Kaylee Poulton case had lasting impacts on the Rochester community and particularly on the apartment complex where she lived and disappeared. For the neighbors who joined the search for Kaylee, who cooperated with police investigations, who allowed their homes to be searched, and who later learned that the killer had been living among them all along, the case likely created a sense of violated trust and lost innocence. People who had believed their community was safe, who had allowed their own children to play in the yard where Kaylee disappeared, who had perhaps interacted with Mark Christie without recognizing the danger he represented, had to confront the reality that terrible things could happen even in places that seemed secure. Some families likely made changes in response to Kaylee's case, being more cautious about where their children played, being more vigilant about who their children spent time with, having conversations about safety that they might not have had otherwise. The apartment complex itself became associated with tragedy. Real estate professionals know that properties where notorious crimes occurred can suffer stigma that affects their value and desirability. While individual residents were not responsible for what Mark Christie did, the complex as a whole bore the stain of being the place where that little girl was killed. For children who lived in the complex and who were old enough to understand what had happened, Kaylee's case may have been a traumatic introduction to the reality that bad things happen and that adults sometimes hurt children. These children may have struggled with fear, anxiety, or difficulty trusting adults. The case also likely affected how law enforcement in Rochester approached missing children cases in the future. The initial failure to identify Mark Christie as Kaylee's killer, the reliance on polygraph results that proved unreliable, and the eventual solution of the case through his spontaneous confession all provided lessons that influenced subsequent investigations. While the details of how Kaylee has been memorialized by her family and community are not fully documented in the public record, it is common for families who lose children to violence to find ways to honor their memory and ensure they are not forgotten. Some families establish scholarships in their children's names, creating educational opportunities for other young people as a way of bringing something positive out of tragedy. Others work with community organizations to create playgrounds, parks, or other facilities dedicated to the memory of their lost child. Some become advocates for child safety, for victims' rights, for changes in law enforcement practices, or for other causes related to the circumstances of their child's death. This advocacy work can serve multiple purposes: honoring the child's memory, preventing similar tragedies from happening to other families, and giving the grieving parent a sense of purpose and meaning. Others prefer quieter, more private forms of remembrance, maintaining grave sites, keeping photo albums and mementos, gathering with close family and friends on anniversaries, and finding personal ways to keep their child's memory alive in their hearts. Whatever form it takes, memorialization serves important psychological and social functions. It acknowledges that the lost child mattered, that their life, though tragically short, had meaning and value. It provides a focus for grief and a way for family and community to express continuing love and remembrance. For Judy Poulton, who spent 2 years actively searching for Kaylee and keeping her case in the public eye, the impulse to ensure that Kaylee would not be forgotten was already deeply ingrained. That same determination that drove Judy to print flyers, contact media outlets, and speak on national television likely continued in different forms after Kaylee's body was recovered and Mark Christie was convicted. Despite the resolution of the criminal case against Mark Christie and the answers his confession provided about what happened to Kaylee, several questions remain unanswered or only partially answered. The question of Mark's true motives remains somewhat murky. His confession claimed that he panicked when he heard Judy calling for Kaylee and killed her to prevent being discovered with the child in his apartment. However, Detective Crow and others suspected that Mark's actual motive was sexual, that he lured Kaylee to his apartment, intending to molest her and killed her to prevent her from reporting the abuse. Because the advanced decomposition of Kaylee's body made it impossible for medical examiners to determine whether sexual assault had occurred, this question cannot be definitively answered based on physical evidence. Mark denied sexually assaulting Kaylee, but given his pattern of dishonesty and his tendency to minimize the severity of his actions, his denial is not particularly credible. The question of whether Mark had other victims besides Viola Manville and Kaylee Poulton also remains unanswered. The 6-year gap between these two murders, the differences between the victims, and Mark's demonstrated ability to evade detection all raise the possibility that there were other crimes he committed that have not been discovered. However, without confession or physical evidence, these suspicions cannot be confirmed. Mark has shown no willingness to provide information about any additional crimes, and investigators have not found definitive connections between him and other unsolved cases. The question of what might have been done differently to prevent Kaylee's death is one that family members, law enforcement officials, and community members may struggle with indefinitely. If investigators had not relied so heavily on the polygraph results that incorrectly indicated Mark was truthful, might they have looked at him more closely? If the reports of Mark's inappropriate behavior around children had been investigated more thoroughly, might he have been identified as a danger before he had the opportunity to harm Kaylee? These questions are natural, but ultimately unanswerable. They reflect the very human desire to find some point where different choices might have led to a different outcome. Some moment where tragedy might have been averted. The reality is that Mark Christie alone bears responsibility for his decision to harm Kaylee. While there may be lessons to learn from the case about how to better protect children and investigate crimes, the fundamental cause of Kaylee's death was Mark's choice to commit murder, not failures by others to prevent it. As previously noted, Mark Christie continues to serve his prison sentence for the murders of Kaylee Poulton and Viola Manville. He received a minimum of 25 years for Kaylee's murder and an additional 28 years for Viola's murder. The exact details of when Mark might become eligible for parole depend on how the sentences were structured, whether they run concurrently, at the same time, or consecutively, one after the other, and on the specific requirements of New York's parole system. If the sentences run consecutively, Mark would need to serve a minimum of 53 years total before becoming eligible for parole. Given that he was 22 years old when he killed Kaylee in 1994, consecutive sentences would make him at least 75 years old before he could even be considered for parole. If the sentences run concurrently, the parole eligibility calculation becomes more complex, but Mark would still likely need to serve at least 25 to 30 years before being considered for release. This would make him at least in his late 40s or early 50s before parole consideration. However, eligibility for parole consideration does not guarantee release. Parole boards evaluate multiple factors, including the severity of the original crimes, the inmate's behavior while incarcerated, evidence of rehabilitation and remorse, and assessment of whether the inmate poses a continued danger to public safety. In Mark Christie's case, several factors work strongly against the likelihood of parole being granted. He committed 2 murders targeting vulnerable victims. He has shown minimal genuine remorse, focusing primarily on his own suffering rather than empathy for his victims. He has demonstrated a capacity for violence, deception, and calculated planning that suggests significant danger. Unless Mark undergoes profound psychological change during his incarceration and can demonstrate genuine rehabilitation, it seems unlikely that any parole board would feel comfortable releasing him back into society. The risk that he might offend again would be considered too high. Therefore, While the technical possibility of eventual parole exists, the practical likelihood is that Mark Christie will spend the rest of his life in prison, dying behind bars as an elderly man if he lives that long, never experiencing freedom as an adult. This outcome represents a form of justice for Kaylee Poulton, for Viola Manville, and for their families. It ensures that Mark cannot harm anyone else. It provides recognition that the crimes he committed were so serious that society cannot allow him to return to normal life. The story of V. Kaylee Poulton is ultimately a story of profound loss, of a bright young life extinguished far too early by someone who chose cruelty over compassion. It is a story that exemplifies the worst of human nature, the capacity for violence against the most innocent and vulnerable among us. But it is also a story that demonstrates some of the best of human nature. It shows us Judy Poulton's unwavering determination to find her daughter, her refusal to give up hope even when the situation seemed hopeless, her tireless advocacy that kept Kaylee's case alive for 2 long years. It shows us a community coming together to search for a missing child, neighbors supporting one another in crisis, strangers contributing money to reward funds and helping distribute flyers for a little girl they had never met. It shows us Detective Crow's skillful and patient work to obtain a confession that finally brought answers and justice, his willingness to spend hours building rapport with the suspect, rather than using coercive tactics that might have backfired. It shows us the power of advancing forensic science to correct past injustices, to free innocent people who have been wrongly convicted, and to identify guilty parties who thought they had escaped justice. The case provides important lessons for law enforcement about the limitations of polygraph testing, the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, the value of preserving evidence even from seemingly solved cases, and the importance of interrogation techniques that seek truth rather than simply seeking confessions. It provides lessons for communities about the importance of taking warning signs seriously, of teaching children about safety and appropriate behavior by adults, and of maintaining vigilance while also avoiding paranoia. It provides lessons for policymakers about the need for robust victim services, for conviction integrity review processes, for DNA database management, and for balanced approaches to spousal privilege that protect marital relationships while not shielding serious criminals from accountability. Most importantly, the case reminds us that behind every crime statistic, every news headline, every case number, there are real people whose lives have been profoundly affected. Kaylee Poulton was not just a victim in a murder case, she was a 4-year-old girl who loved riding her tricycle, who played with other children in her apartment complex yard, who was loved deeply by her mother and father. Viola Manville was not just a cold case, she was a 74-year-old woman who deserved to live out her remaining years in peace and safety. Not to be brutally murdered while taking a walk in her neighborhood. Frank Sterling was not just a statistic about wrongful conviction, he was a real person who lost 19 years of his life to a terrible miscarriage of justice, who fought unsuccessfully for nearly 2 decades to prove his innocence and who had only a brief period to enjoy his freedom before his life ended. Judy Poulton was not just a victim's mother. She was and is a human being who endured unimaginable pain, who found the strength to keep fighting when most people would have collapsed under the weight of grief and uncertainty, and who ultimately had to learn to live with answers that, while providing some closure, could never restore what she had lost. These are the real stakes of criminal justice, not abstract principles or legal theories, but human lives, human suffering, human resilience, and human dignity. The Kaylee Poulton case stands as a sobering reminder of the predators who live among us, often hiding behind masks of normalcy and respectability. Mark Christie maintained a family, held a job, and presented himself as an ordinary member of the community while harboring violent impulses and a willingness to harm the most vulnerable. The case also demonstrates the critical importance of persistence in seeking justice. Without Judy Poulton's tireless advocacy, without Detective Crow's skillful interrogation, without the decision to reopen Viola Manville's case and re-examine old evidence with new technology, multiple injustices might have remained unresolved indefinitely. Kaylee would have remained missing, her fate unknown, her body concealed in a place where it might never have been found. Judy would have lived the rest of her life not knowing what happened to her daughter, trapped in an agonizing limbo between hope and grief. Mark Christie would have continued living freely, potentially harming other victims, his crimes undetected and unpunished. Frank Sterling would have died in prison, an innocent man convicted of a murder he did not commit, his name forever associated with a terrible crime he had no part in. Viola Manville's real killer would have remained unidentified, her murder unsolved, her family denied closure. Instead, through the combined efforts of determined family members, skilled investigators, advancing forensic science, and even the eventual confession of the perpetrator himself, justice was ultimately served. Not perfect justice, nothing could undo the harm that was done, but meaningful accountability that acknowledged the wrongs committed and removed a dangerous predator from society. The lessons of this case continue to resonate in how law enforcement approaches missing children investigations, how the criminal justice system handles potentially wrongful convictions, how communities work to protect children from predators, and how families of victims navigate their grief while seeking answers and justice. Kaylee Poulton's life was tragically short, ended by an act of senseless violence when she was only 4 years old. She deserved so much more, a chance to grow up, to experience life, to pursue dreams, to love and be loved. That future was stolen from her, but her case has contributed to important changes and learning that may help protect other children, may help other families find answers, and may help the criminal justice system function more effectively and fairly. In that sense, Kaylee's legacy extends beyond her brief life, touching lives and influencing systems in ways that continue to this day. This is the story of Kaylee Poulton, a story of tragedy and loss, but also of love, determination, justice, and the ongoing struggle to protect the innocent and hold wrongdoers accountable. It is a story that deserves to be told and remembered, honoring Kaylee's memory and ensuring that the lessons learned from this terrible crime continue to inform how we protect children and pursue justice. As we reflect on Kaylee's story, we are reminded of the importance of vigilance, community, and action in protecting children and supporting families affected by violence. If you notice concerning behavior by adults around children, trust your instincts and report your concerns to appropriate authorities. If you have information about missing children or unsolved crimes, come forward. Your information might be the key that brings justice and closure to a grieving family. Support organizations that work to protect children, to find missing persons, to support crime victims and their families, to review potentially wrongful convictions, and to advance forensic science. Talk to the children in your life about body safety, about appropriate and inappropriate behavior by adults, about the importance of telling trusted adults if something makes them uncomfortable, even if they have been told to keep it secret. Remember that behind every crime statistic is a real person, a real family, real suffering that extends far beyond what news headlines can convey. Treat victims and their families with the compassion and respect they deserve. And never forget Kaylee Poulton, a little girl who loved riding her tricycle, who brought joy to her mother's life, and whose story reminds us why the work of protecting children and pursuing justice matters so profoundly. Thank you for taking the time to learn about Kaylee's story. May her memory continue to inspire us to create safer communities, to fight for justice, and to protect the most vulnerable among us. Share your thoughts on this case in the comments. If this story moved you or taught you something important, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another case. Together, we can honor victims like Kaylee by staying informed, staying vigilant, and working to create a world where every child can grow up safe and protected.